I work as a court clerk at my local courthouse, splitting my time between the clerk of courts, COC office, and the courtroom. On a recent Friday, I was at my desk in the COC office, where I also help customers with questions about certain filings. One of my duties includes covering our records window as backup. In my state, our office deals with public records, so anyone can come in and request copies from any case unless it's juvenile, confidential, or sealed by the court. This detail becomes important for what happened that day. Around 4:15 p.m., a man we refer to as a frequent flyer came in. Let's call him Mark. He has an ongoing family case and comes in about once a week to get copies. The layout of our office is relevant. It's set up a bit like the DMV. You enter through a main entrance, go down a long hallway, and arrive in a lobby with elevators and the DA's office on the left and the COC on the right. Our area has a separate set of doors leading into a small lobby with a counter and windows arranged in an L shape. The records window, where I was stationed, is in the back corner. Mark approached the window to tell me he had requested some documents. When people request documents from the public terminals, they go into a queue, which I then print. I confirmed with him that he was expecting 11 pages, printed them, and directed him to the cashier to pay. After dealing with a small printer jam, I delivered his pages to the cashier and returned to assist the next customer. As I was finishing up, my coworker Carla asked if I wanted to go thrifting at a nearby store after work, and I agreed. Right then, I noticed Mark had returned to the counter. I asked how I could help him, and he made a comment suggesting I was new, though I've worked there for nearly 4 years. Mark then pointed out a paperweight on my desk, a painted rock from my niece. After mentioning that, he told me I'd given him the wrong case. I rechecked and saw he didn't need 4 of the pages I'd printed. He only needed 7, so I adjusted his slip and sent him back to the cashier. At 4:30, I left work and headed to the thrift store, where I arrived first and browsed until Carla joined me. While we shopped and chatted, I suddenly saw Mark enter the store. He was hard to miss in his signature hat. Feeling uneasy, I nudged Carla and we ducked down an aisle. Mark walked around, scanning the store as if searching. He picked up a random pair of shoes, looked at them briefly, then continued looking around. Carla and I moved in the opposite direction each time he moved, using clothing racks to keep hidden. Eventually, he left. We checked the parking lot to make sure he was gone. The next day, I still felt uneasy, so I told my boss what happened and decided to call the police. I left a message with dispatch, and an officer called me back a few hours later. I explained the situation, and he advised me to get Mark's full name and call him back later in the week. I recognized Mark but didn't know his last name, so I retrieved it and left another message for the officer on Monday. Later that week, Mark returned. He arrived at 4:20 p.m. to file documents for his case, which took him about 20 minutes, much longer than usual. As he was leaving, I felt that same unease, so I informed the officer. The officer suggested I call again if Mark returned so they could speak with him. Thursday afternoon, Mark arrived again, heading straight to the public terminal. My boss had already set up a safety plan, and courthouse security was alerted. 3 sheriff's deputies followed him into our office, and 2 police officers came as well. They questioned Mark, who admitted he had been at the thrift store, claiming he was shopping for his 2 young daughters, even though they wouldn't typically shop there. Mark showed a receipt from a nearby children's store from later that evening, but denied overhearing my conversation with Carla about going there after work. When officers questioned him, he immediately asked if I had called them and claimed his ex-wife was trying to set him up. Unfortunately, since our office is public and he had legitimate reasons to be there, the officers couldn't do much. They issued him a verbal warning and put him on standby. The odd part is that Mark could access his case electronically. He'd once expressed frustration with the system, and we'd advised him to contact support, but he still chooses to come in regularly and pay per-page fees, even though he already paid the one-time access fee. To make matters worse, Mark's past behavior includes a restraining order filed by a former roommate and a complaint from the roommate's girlfriend for alleged harassment. His family case is also highly complicated, and he files many intricate legal documents on his own. On Friday, I returned to my desk after a day in court, only to find Mark arriving at the office. I left before he could approach me. Now, I'm not sure what to do next. The police can't act further unless Mark does something outside my workplace, but his actions make me feel unsafe. I've since ordered home security, signed up for self-defense classes, bought mace, and am considering additional safety options. I'm doing everything I can think of, but I still feel uneasy. I had the closing shift, so I was alone and trying to clear the line before we closed in 5 minutes. People kept coming in, so I announced that we'd only be handling copies and prints, as shipments were already cut off. I had already turned away another customer wanting to ship an item. Then, a woman arrived just a minute before closing with a large box. I didn't notice her box at first, since I was helping several customers simultaneously. As I glanced at the clock and saw it was closing time, I hurried to lock the door and finally saw her box. I asked if it was a drop-off, thinking it would be a quick scan and receipt. But she wanted to ship it out, and I explained that we weren't processing shipments anymore because we were closed. She didn't like this answer. She asked why I wouldn't process her shipment. I pointed to the door showing our hours. She insisted we weren't closed, clearly determined to push for her shipment. I went back to help the remaining customers, but she started raising her voice, accusing me of being discriminatory. I repeated that we were closed and asked her to leave if she was going to be disrespectful, but she refused. Ignoring her didn't help. She started shouting insults, some of which included personal slurs and offensive remarks about my ethnicity. She even got in my face multiple times, calling me all sorts of names and threatening to follow me out so she could see where I lived. When I asked her to leave, she stayed put, taunting me and daring me to call the police. At this point, I didn't want to be alone with her, so I called a nearby co-worker to come over, then contacted the police. I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher while she continued yelling at me. Soon, she pulled out her phone and started recording me, even pushing her phone close to my face. I instinctively knocked her phone aside and told her to stop. She responded by smacking me, breaking my glasses and throwing them in the trash. I reported everything to the dispatcher, who could hear the commotion through the phone. The woman continued recording me, telling me she'd make sure I was exposed online. The police finally arrived with one officer escorting her outside while the other stayed to get our stories. By that time, my coworker had arrived and confirmed with the officers that he'd seen her erratic behavior on the security cameras. Unfortunately, because she had footage of me knocking her phone away, the situation became complicated legally. We each provided statements, and the officers left after gathering information. My coworker helped me close up, and I waited for my parents to bring my spare glasses since I couldn't drive without them. In the end, I left an hour and a half after closing. Thankfully, she wasn't there when I went to my car. To that customer, wherever you are, I hope you got what you needed out of that experience. Let's never meet again. Right after high school, I worked the night shift at a 24-hour superstore, stuck behind the register for hours. For 2 tough years, I dealt with angry customers and unfriendly coworkers, screaming, shoving, and even a spiteful old lady who aimed her frustration at me over the price of oranges. But one night stands out, a night that still chills me, when a customer pushed things way too far. The shift started like any other. The second I got to my register, A line was already waiting, and I moved into autopilot, mechanically asking if people found everything all right. My attention focused on ringing up their items quickly. Most people didn't even look at me, just waiting to get out of there. Then I got to this guy. He had only 2 things, a yogurt and a box of Band-Aids. I rang them up quickly, bagged them, and looked up to hand it over. But he was just standing there, his eyes fixed on the conveyor belt as if he were in a trance. He wouldn't answer my greeting or even look at me. He wore an old brown denim jacket, stained and musty, carrying a stale mix of BO and cigarettes that hit me every time he moved. His hands were rough and cracked, red from the cold, as he started digging through his pockets for change. When he finally dumped some coins on the counter, it still wasn't enough. He was about 30 cents short. I let him know, and that's when he finally looked up at me. His eyes were deep, dark, and cold, almost black. They bore into me, unsettling, as if he didn't believe me or thought I was trying to cheat him. While he stared, I counted the change again to be sure. I felt my face freeze as he insisted that it was only 30 cents and that I could just give him my employee discount. I tried to be polite, telling him that wasn't allowed, and I suggested that he could put something back. He wasn't the first person to ask, but most people at least pretended to joke about it. He wasn't joking. His eyes narrowed as he said he wanted them both. I felt a cold shiver down my spine. I was already wishing he'd go back to staring at the conveyor belt. The cash in my register was under my responsibility, and I knew I'd get called out for it. So I held firm. If I'd had 30 cents on me, I would have paid it just to make him go away. But instead I stood there as he reached for the bag, and I reflexively turned the carousel to keep it from him. I knew it probably wasn't the best idea, but I couldn't just let him take it. He leaned in, eyes narrowing, muttering that I could give him a discount if I wanted to. I swallowed and told him I could call a supervisor if he needed more help, though I knew it might take a while for them to get there. The tension thickened as he leaned in further, his dark eyes boring into me. I glanced at the line of customers behind him, hoping for some support, but they just looked away. When I mentioned getting the supervisor, he finally snapped, muttering under his breath, saying it was just a few cents. With one last glare, he shoved the change back in his pocket, stomped away, and finally left. I felt the air release from my lungs, and I went back to work, though I couldn't shake the unsettled feeling that stuck with me long after. Hours later, I finally clocked out at midnight, relieved to be heading home. My mom was out of town, so I decided to walk instead of calling for a ride. It was quiet, with no one else around, and I told myself I'd be fine. A few minutes into my walk, I noticed a car driving slowly behind me. The speed limit was 45, but this car was barely keeping pace with my brisk walk. My stomach twisted, trying to rationalize it. Maybe they were lost? But the car didn't pull up or pass. It just crawled along behind me. After a tense few minutes, the car finally turned down a side street, and I exhaled, trying to relax. But then, I heard the door open and footsteps on the pavement. I glanced back and felt my blood go cold. It was Yogurt and Band-Aids guy. He was wearing the same brown jacket, and those dark, unsettling eyes were trained on me as he walked closer. I picked up my pace, my pulse pounding as I realized he was matching my steps, coming up beside me. I could even hear the change jingling in his pocket. I was practically running on the icy sidewalk, slipping a little, when he came up just close enough for me to hear his whisper. He wanted to know the color of my underwear. I didn't even think. Without stopping, I turned and swung my fist right into his face. My hand throbbed, but he stumbled, clutching his face, muttering something I couldn't catch. I didn't wait to find out. I just bolted, running down side streets and zigzagging through neighborhoods, too scared to look back, praying he wasn't following. I didn't go straight home, worried he might still be on my trail. By the time I finally got back, I was too shaken to sleep. I sat in the dark, listening for any sound outside, afraid to even look out the window. The next day I told my managers what happened, but they just shrugged, brushing it off like nothing had happened. They didn't care that I was scared, that a customer had waited for me outside work. I was angry and frustrated, knowing they wouldn't help even if it happened again. I quit not long after that night, but sometimes I still think back to his face, those dark, hollow eyes. In high school, I had the glamorous job of scooping ice cream at a well-known local chain. I'd been working there for about 3 years, and this story happened at the start of my senior year. It was one of those slow weeknights, probably a Monday or Tuesday, and on those closing shifts, it was just the two of us on duty, a manager and a server. I was the server, and my manager, Jen, was a woman in her early 20s. That night, she was in the back counting our shift's cash while I began cleaning the front of the store to prepare for closing. About 30 minutes before closing, a sleek, expensive car pulled up right outside. I remember thinking it was unusual for this area. A few minutes later, a man came in. He was white, maybe in his early 30s, with brown hair and a wide smile. He had an odd energy about him. He walked past the counter and sat down at one of the tables, spreading out a portfolio and starting to write on some papers. I couldn't help feeling a little annoyed that he'd chosen an ice cream shop at 8:30 p.m. to get some work done, especially when there was a Starbucks right next door. I continued cleaning, and after a while, he approached the counter as though ready to order. Right away, I noticed something unsettling in his body language. He leaned against the ice cream case, getting as close to me as possible without actually climbing over it. Immediately, I felt a strange chill, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was, a 5'3", 105-pound 17-year-old alone, with a man twice my size. Jen was still in the back, completely unaware. When he ordered, I didn't catch all the details, but it was something unusual, a weird combination of flavors and toppings. As I turned around to prepare his order, I felt his eyes practically boring into my back. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, leaning over the case, forearms on top, grinning. He started talking, asking if it was always this slow at night, telling me I looked pretty. I forced myself to finish his order as quickly as possible so I could turn back around. When I handed it to him and rang it up, his total was around $5 or $6, but he took out a $20 bill and tried to tip me. I declined, saying it was too much, but he just smiled wider and stuffed it into the tip jar. I thanked him, my heart racing, and caught sight of Jen standing in the kitchen doorway, out of his view, but motioning for me to come over. I walked away from the counter while he went back to his table. Before I could say anything, Jen told me she didn't feel right about him and was going to call our other manager, Ryan, who lived about 5 minutes away. Ryan was a tall college student, and his presence would make us both feel safer. I nodded, relieved, and told her I'd try to encourage the guy to leave since it was getting close to closing time. Within a few minutes, Ryan arrived, walking in and giving the customer a hard look before heading to the back to talk with Jen. The customer seemed to realize what was happening and watched Ryan disappear through the door. With Jen and Ryan watching from the back, the man got up, gathered his papers, and walked back to the ice cream case. Then he turned to me and said my name. I froze. I had no idea how he knew my name. Slowly, he set a small piece of paper on the counter, smiled one last time, and walked out. The second he was gone, Ryan locked the door, and we looked at the paper together. Written in pencil were the man's full contact details: his name, cell phone number, email address, even a Twitter handle. We called the police and told them everything. They listened but said he hadn't done anything illegal, though they advised us to call if he returned. The whole situation left me feeling deeply disturbed. The fancy car, his lingering presence in the ice cream shop so late, his odd, too friendly comments, the massive tip. But most unsettling was how he'd known my name. I didn't have my name tag on, and even if I had, it would have only shown a nickname. I'd never seen him before, and there was no reason he should have known me. My managers later guessed that he could have been a sugar daddy type, or even worse, someone involved in trafficking, scoping me out. I never felt my instincts kick in that strongly again, and I stayed on high alert until I left for college. Now I'm 24 and I haven't seen him since. But sometimes, late at night, I think back to that man in the ice cream shop and wonder what he truly wanted. I'm a college student working in retail, and over winter break I took as many shifts as I could because first semester left me broke. In the first few weeks of January, I had a lot of closing shifts at the register and on the sales floor. They were usually pretty quiet. One night a man came to the register with a return and then came back later with a lot of random clothes. It wasn't unusual for someone to have multiple transactions, especially after the holidays. He looked to be in his mid-50s, had a South Asian accent, and distinct salt and pepper hair. Before I go any further, I should mention that I'm also a guy, and I'm gay, but I usually use a fake customer voice so people can't tell. This man talked to me for a while, and I felt strangely comfortable with him. At one point, he asked about my pant size and told me to step back from the register so he could see my lower body. Many people ask about my size, usually to compare it with their teenage sons, so I didn't think much of it at first. Then he commented on my butt being big. I laughed awkwardly, thinking that people had told me that before, and instantly regretted saying anything. He asked to see it, and in that moment I almost did. My conscience screamed that it was a bad idea, and I stopped myself. I said it was a bad idea, and that I would get him in trouble over a joke. He just looked at me and said that nobody was watching. He kept chatting until I turned to fold one of his items. He mentioned that my friends were right about my butt. I turned around, and he kept saying my name, which he saw on my name tag. I put my hand on the register while I waited for his receipt to print. He placed his hand on top of mine, and I quickly turned it into a handshake to make it feel normal. He said it was nice to meet me and then walked out. Then he came back with more random things. Before he could say anything else, another customer arrived, and he suddenly stopped talking. He mouthed something to me at the register and left. He returned again after the next customer left. He asked for the bathroom, went, and came back less than 30 seconds later. Then he asked if I worked the next day. I felt a wave of panic and just said the first thing that came to mind, which was the truth. I said yes, and he smiled and left. The next day, I came to work because I would get in trouble if I called out. As I worked on the sales floor, I thought nothing would happen. I joked about the man with my coworker. Then he walked in. My stomach dropped and I quickly ran to the bathroom to hide. My walkie-talkie fell out of my pocket, but I was too scared to pick it up. I called all my coworkers, but no one answered their phones because our managers were strict about that. I felt trapped when I heard footsteps outside the bathroom. I felt like I might be sick, but I opened the door and saw a white man with his kid. Thank goodness. I dashed for my walkie and told my manager what was happening. She let me stay in the back for 10 minutes, but then made me return to work because making women's leggings look nice was more important than a man prowling the store. He walked around for 45 minutes, and my coworkers stayed close to me. My closest friend said it looked like a lion searching for prey in the store. He checked every corner, and I was grateful to have great coworkers to keep me moving and safe whenever he came near. Eventually, he returned every item he had bought with me the day before. He told the cashier that he would come back again tomorrow, but I didn't work then, so I didn't know what happened. I never saw him again. I was wrong to think that, as a man, I would never be targeted by someone like that. I won't be returning to this job in the summer because my manager's response didn't feel right to me. I hope to find a job where safety is the priority, not an afterthought. I recently got a job at Walmart in online grocery. I don't talk to customers as much as cashiers or customer service, but I still answer questions and help people find things. Most days are okay, but I do deal with rude customers. Luckily, I haven't had many creepy encounters, which is nice compared to my last jobs where men often made unwanted comments about my body and tattoos. It all started around noon when I went out for my first pick run. I was in the soda aisle, trying to fit a box of beer into my cart when a guy came up and helped me. He looked to be in his early 20s, a bit shorter than me, and wore a corn shirt. I thanked him and said I liked his shirt. He complimented my hair. It seemed harmless, so I went back to my work, hoping nothing bad would happen that night. About 15 minutes later, I was in the soup aisle, crouched down bagging cans of Dinty Moore when I heard someone say, "Excuse me." I felt excited because nobody ever says that to get my attention. I stood up and turned to see the same guy. He said he was looking for baking soda and needed help. The baking aisle was just a few shelves over, and I needed bread flour next, so I offered to show him where the baking soda was. He thanked me, and I finished scanning the last can. When we reached the baking aisle, I found the baking soda and turned to pick out the bread flour. There were so many options, and I noticed he put a small box of Arm & Hammer in his cart. He stood there on his phone, occasionally glancing at me. It felt a bit strange, but I thought maybe he was just feeling awkward. I finished my pick run, staged the totes on my cart, and brought everything to the back. After 2 more runs, I took my first break, enjoying a salad and a cherry Pepsi while talking with a coworker. I thought I saw a corn guy pass by, but I figured it was just someone else in a similar shirt. When I returned from my break, my manager asked me to do 3 more pick runs before switching to dispensing orders. I was out on a produce run when I saw Corn Guy again, standing near the corn. I laughed to myself for a moment, realizing he had been at Walmart for over an hour with only 3 items in his cart. I tried to ignore him, but I felt increasingly uneasy. He walked up to me and said hi. I said hi back and asked if he needed anything. Then he started saying some really creepy things. He told me that I didn't have to eat salad if I didn't want to, and that I was beautiful just as I am. I stood there in shock. I liked salads, especially the ones loaded with dressing and toppings. I also had a boyfriend who didn't care about my eating habits. It was frustrating that a stranger, someone who had spent the entire day at Walmart, thought I needed his approval. I told him that what he said was inappropriate and that he should stay away from employee-only areas. He looked surprised, as if I hadn't been nice enough, so I ended my pick run early to report him to a manager. In the back, I explained everything to my manager. I told her I didn't want to go back out while he was around. She understood and let me start dispensing early, sending someone else to pick in my place. The rest of the day went fine, until I had to deliver a large order to the main parking lot, where I saw Corn Guy sitting on a bench. I hoped he was just waiting for someone to pick him up. I finished putting away returns without seeing him, and ended my shift at 8 p.m. I turned in my handheld and key card before saying goodbye to my co-workers. I always parked in the main lot right in front of the grocery section, and as I walked towards my car, it was starting to get dark. It had been raining on and off all day, creating a mix of warm and cool air. As I unlocked my old CRV, I saw a corn guy approaching me again. I felt scared, wondering what he wanted, but I held my keys tightly, aware that my pepper spray was visible. He walked up and tried to talk to me. I quickly told him that he had been following me all day, which made me uncomfortable. I said that if he needed help with something at Walmart, he should talk to customer service. And if he wanted to talk to me personally, I wasn't interested and needed him to leave me alone. He looked offended, and then said something even more ridiculous. He said that since I was going to act that way, he wouldn't ask me out and called me ungrateful. He thought I was cool and that I could understand him, but now he saw me as just like every other girl. I was curious and asked him what he meant. He rambled on about how I seemed unique because of my stretched ears and how I should appreciate Korn's music. Then he pulled out a cheap little switchblade from his sweatpants pocket. It was a pathetic sight, something that couldn't even scare a small animal. I felt even more insulted, not just by his attempt at being intimidating, but also by how absurd the situation was. I got in my car, told him to go away, and slammed the door, eager to leave. Since then, I haven't seen him again, but since I work almost every day, I know it's only a matter of time before he shows up again. So to the creepy guy in the Korn shirt who pulled a knife on me in the Walmart parking lot, I really hope I never have to see you again. This has been happening over the last few days. I'm feeling a bit shaken up, so I apologize if this comes across as confusing. I recently moved about 1,600 miles away from Florida, leaving everyone behind. Now, I'm living alone with just my dog. I've been working at this restaurant for 2 months now, and I never encountered this problem at my old job. I work at a popular fast food chain, and there's a guy named Carl who comes in every day. Due to new company rules, we have to be overly nice to customers and get to know our regulars on a first-name basis. I can handle that. I'm good at customer service. The other day, we introduced ourselves. He seemed like a nice guy, probably in his late 30s to early 40s, but I found out later that he's actually 47. When I came into work one day, I patted him on the arm as I walked by to say hi. It felt friendly enough, but then he started making me uncomfortable. Recently, Carl came in and sat with his co-workers in a different spot than usual. He handed me his business card, told me to text him later, winked at me, and then sat down while casually glancing over at me. I told a few of my managers about it, and they all laughed. I felt uneasy until he finally left, and then I tried to convince myself that I had overreacted. After all, maybe he thought I was interested just because I was nice. But things escalated. The next day, when I was at the cash register, he came up and apologized if he had been too forward. I said it was fine and moved on to the next customer. He left, but then I saw him sitting again in the takeout area, staring at me. I tried to avoid him, but he waved and asked why I hadn't texted him. I showed him my hand with a fake engagement ring, a plan my mom, boyfriend, and I came up with since they were back in Florida and couldn't help me. He seemed to take the hint and left me alone for a moment. Then he returned, asking for more ice. I let a coworker get it, knowing he just wanted me to do it. Later, he came back asking for toothpicks. Again, I got someone else to help him. My coworkers were beginning to understand why I was freaking out in the back, trying to avoid Carl. Fast forward to 3:15, just 45 minutes before I was off work. He came back in alone for a bag of chips. He sat in a corner where I couldn't see him, then moved to the takeout window, and then back to his hiding spot. Eventually, he approached the window where I was standing. I said hey, but he didn't respond. He just stared at me for what felt like 30 seconds before walking away. I saw him leave around 3:45, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had someone walk me to my car, and then I went to buy pepper spray. Throughout the day, my general manager joked about the situation, and another manager, who hadn't seen Carl's behavior, insisted he was a nice guy. Thankfully, my coworker Jen defended me. What's most messed up is that my manager refuses to ban him from the restaurant, despite admitting his behavior is creepy. I talked to my old manager back in Florida, and he said he would have banned Carl after the first incident. Now I'm stuck having to interact with him. So, Carl, I might see you tomorrow, and I wish I could say let's not meet again. Please, just leave me alone.